Welcome to Thinking Deeply about Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And Neil Almond.
Hello.
And together, we'll try and answer the question, how do you solve a problem like struggling mathematicians? But first, I'd like to take a second to tell you about the TDAPE Discord server. A link can be found as part of the show description. And really, it's a place for members of the TDAPE family to chat about all things that we hold dear, as well as supporting each other in our continued professional development. Links have a 7-day limit, but I'll share them regularly under episodes and over at thinkingdeeply.info. But if we turn our attention to the main focus of this episode, what do we mean by struggling mathematicians?
I think there are different ways that we can define struggling mathematicians, or different lenses through which we could look at this concept. I think it's such a broad topic that we're probably better off looking at one aspect in particular. I mean, we could look at struggling mathematicians in terms of those with particular needs. We could look at struggling mathematicians in terms of different aspects of mathematics that someone or a group of children might struggle with. I think what it's most productive for us to talk about, though, is the kind of struggling mathematician that teachers will most commonly face and that will provide them with arguably the greatest challenges in their practice. And by that, I mean mathematicians that struggle on a lesson by lesson basis because of specific gaps in their mathematical understanding.
I agree, because there are lots, in fact, too many contributing factors to what is broadly referred to as struggling mathematicians. So I think if we take one refined focus and then certainly revisit other aspects in other episodes, I think that'll be probably the best use of the format. I think before we go into the common knowledge gaps, the critical knowledge gaps, I think one thing that always really stuck with me was reading David Geary's work. And he speaks, obviously, I think probably most famous for his work on biologically primary and secondary sort of knowledge. But he did an extended piece on why children struggle with mathematics. And it's because of the fact that it takes up so much of our mental capacity, because it's so at times alien, the way we represent mathematics, that you need nothing less than 100% attention. And like we say, all of those pieces to be in place. Otherwise, we're spending mental capacity on things that we should know, don't know, and then can't apply in lessons that come forward. So whenever we talk about, those gaps, that was the first thing that came to mind. And I just thought I will definitely link it in the show notes, but I think acknowledging that mathematics itself, while beautiful and fascinating subject, requires a lot of effort to learn. And those kids who appear to naturally get mathematics are actually benefiting from having a really robust understanding of the fundamentals, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that perhaps there are different ways to identify children that are likely to be your struggling mathematicians, ways to identify these critical knowledge gaps. Obviously, standardized assessment is one way of seeing children and seeing these gaps that these children have and identifying those that might need extra support in a variety of ways that I'm sure we're going to talk about. But in my experience, just as value is the informal assessment, the day-to-day knowledge of the children that you develop from what you see in the classroom, what you see in their books, what you see from the conversations that they have. Just a very brief aside, it's worth noting as well, particularly if you're not the most experienced teacher in the world, how easy it can be for struggling mathematicians to fly under the radar, particularly because they might copy work from their neighbors. If you employ classroom techniques that involve a lot of collaboration, you're not someone that has any real quiet, independent learning time, it can be quite possible for a student to fly under the radar by effectively copying their partner's work or copying the work from different people around the table. I've seen it through the years, and it's sometimes the case where children get further up the school and you'll often have previous teachers saying, oh, well, they're fine in lessons, they just struggle on standardized assessments, or they just struggle on tests. And sometimes that is the case, but also quite often it can be students who find a way to keep from you the fact that they are having these struggles because of significant gaps in their understanding.
Yeah, that's certainly always been a challenge for me, identifying those ones. And I think this goes back to the core of what we're talking about, is that sometimes, and I'm guilty of it as a teacher, those kids get it. So you think as a, maths as a homogenous unit, oh, right, they did really well in that lesson, great. Therefore, they'll be fine throughout the rest of the lesson, throughout the following lessons. And so then your attention kind of diverts away from them, which is just kind of like another way that they then end up actually getting lost because they were successful in this one kind of area, mathematics, because of the hierarchical nature of the subject, just because they were successful in that one little piece of the puzzle, as it were, doesn't mean then that the rest of the puzzle is going to go down smoothly. So it certainly is something to keep an eye on. This is where I think I get a little bit frustrated when it comes to use of teaching assistants, because there's this narrative that teaching assistants always have to be doing something with the children all the time. And I actually think you get a far better understanding of what the class is, how the class are doing, and who those strugglers might be, if actually you just position the teaching assistant so that they actually just watch the class, because you can just tell from certain, movements that they might do, facial expression, those little cues that you might miss out on. I think it's actually probably far more beneficial for as long as there's that brief kind of conversation being like, well, you were doing that input, I noticed child A, B, C, D. Yeah, they were kind of just giving this vibe off that they weren't sure what was really going on. I think that's probably a far more effective way of using them than perhaps just getting them to sit down with a student and kind of just work whilst you're actually modeling what's actually happening.
The teaching assistant relationships that I've had in a classroom that have worked best have been those where we've developed a bit of a system of what to do specifically when children are doing something like independent work, so that they know that it's independent work time. At this point, they might float around the room observing particular children that we know are slightly more likely to struggle. Yeah, developing these routines, making these things explicit with a teaching assistant can be something that supports the learning in your classroom in all subjects, regardless of whether we're talking about mathematics or struggling mathematicians in particular.
I've actually had to utilize that sort of system a lot, because I'm, quite often in 5 or 6 different classes a week, and I don't know those classes as well as I would if I were their main teacher. And so I will ask them, in your opinion, how have they responded to this? Is this what normally happens whenever they encounter something along those lines? Because I'm more often than not modeling being responsive and picking up on cues, which are much easier to come by if you teach a class every day. And so I find those conversations with teaching assistants invaluable, because I'll say, okay, what's your feel for this? Do I think that we need to move on to X? Do you agree? Or is there something else you think we need to focus on first? And so I feel like I have to have that system in place, simply because I can't be familiar with all 1,032 children in our schools. And yeah, so as you were saying, yeah, I've accidentally come onto that behavior because it was necessary in the context. So definitely, I think having that discussion and making time for that discussion is a useful way to utilize teaching assistants. Yeah, I totally agree.
I say it's hard enough doing it when you're just doing it with 30 children that are known 1,192, whatever it was.
Yeah, it's good fun though. I don't remember all their names, but I remember all their faces. And certainly, I'll sometimes spend 6 extended weeks in one class, teaching most days of the week. And then you really get to know them. And then you'll see them a year later for a 6-week period. And you'll be like, yeah, and then I think, certainly the better you know them, the easier the job is in general. Whenever you were talking, Chris, I was thinking back to the episode on subitizing and how we were thinking about all the different pieces that subitizing connects to, and the subitizing, the wheels that subitizing greases. And I think those informal assessment situations are realizing that in order to do this, there is a layer of prerequisites that come before it. That seems to be quite a common way to describe it at the moment. Which knowledge gaps do you guys think are most common, potentially most critical? And then how would you remediate them?
It's hard to judge in terms of what's most common without, like you said most critical there. I think the two have to go hand in hand because, for example, I see children all the time mixing up area and perimeter as a particular knowledge gap. And that is relatively common, but that's not something that I find constantly holding back children's learning in a variety of lessons in the way that other aspects of mathematical knowledge being missing can do. So I think fans of the podcast, should they exist, will not be surprised to hear me mention number bonds in particular, specifically addition and subtraction facts inside 20, because they are the underpinning bit of knowledge for so much more. It can take months and months and months to teach and to understand and to grasp these number bonds inside 20. Once you have them, you can then build on them so much more easily. So, teaching a child who has decent place value knowledge, and I'll come back to that in a moment, who has decent place value knowledge that you can use 9 plus 7 to calculate 90 plus 70 or 900 plus 700 is completely based on their number bonds, and actually a relatively quick thing compared to the development of those number bonds. So I think that's the place where I would start.
Probably going to say whatever, if you were just to reel off a list, I imagine the lists would be would be the same, to be honest, because I've got number bonds, then kind of linked to that, like number sense, place value, but particularly the concept of like unitization. I find some children always kind of particularly really do quite struggle with that particular aspect when we think about place value, and also times tables as well. You just kind of find those are the things that hold the kids back, and those are the things that, I think if you ask any upper key stage 2 teacher, what do you wish these kids came up to knowing, off the back of their hand, I think they'd all say, times tables, just because so much of what we do in terms of fractions, percentages, all kind of fall back on that times table knowledge.
Yeah, and you can diagnose these things relatively simply once you've got a bit of experience. Key questions like, what's 1099 plus 1, or what's 1099 plus 2, and how commonly you would see 2000 or 2001, because they've got this idea that, well, when I see some 9s, I'm going to go up to the next thing with lots of zeros. And that's as far as their place value understanding has progressed when they're talking about numbers beyond 100. So these kind of little diagnostic questions can be invaluable. I think you're dead right about multiplication tables as well. Similar to number bonds, once children grasp, that 35 divided by 7 is 5, being able to apply that to 350 divided by 7 or 350 divided by 70, etc., is so much easier. And I think the thing about number bonds, multiplication tables, place value, I think those are very much like a key 3, is that once those are grasped, they seem to crop up everywhere. They crop up in your teaching of time, your written methods, fractions, area and perimeter. It's almost impossible to avoid them, which means that if the gaps are there, it's almost impossible to teach, or it's almost impossible to move on, which makes things, really challenging. I think a couple of things I might note beyond that would be things that relate to the field axioms. So a general understanding of things like the distributivity of multiplication is one that seems to crop up, quite a useful thing for children to understand. It comes up quite a lot, and that's a gap that's often worth plugging, perhaps not to the same extent as the big three that have been mentioned. Also things like compensation, the value of being able to use compensation for addition and subtraction, and just having that kind of, that's a kind of different bit of knowledge. It's a very specific conceptual idea that once they've grasped it, they can apply it to a variety of different numbers. But again, it's something that if it isn't there, really tends to hold children back. But I'd absolutely agree that, you know, something of a big three, multiplication tables and related division facts, number bonds, and place value understanding.
It's really interesting listening to you guys talk about this, because in one way or another, everything you've mentioned, I would classify as a threshold concept. And the reason I wanted threshold concepts in thinking deeply about primary mathematics is because if we acknowledge those thresholds, then we are considerably more prepared to address them. You know, I'll give a brief summary, but obviously there's a chapter in the book. You know, I think the things that are important for primary teachers to know is that they are, you know, the iterative nature, you know, it's that interconnected nature that you guys are talking about, and how each piece allows access to many, many more pieces. You know, they're normally the most troublesome. So the most difficult things to learn are the most important things to learn. They are discursive in that they change the way we can speak about mathematics and the way we can articulate our thought. You know, because I quite often find that with many of the kids that I teach, it's not that they haven't noticed the pattern, it's just that they can't express it in a way which allows them to make the connections. And then I suppose possibly the most important is that it changes your entire sense of self. So it's like you know, your example about place value, Chris. When you understand place value, by the time you get to 4 digits, we can't understand the actual size. You know, I can't remember when I gave the example, but it was the difference in our minds between 1,000 years and 10,000 years is non-existent. You know, I certainly don't perceive any difference. It's just a long time ago. And we as humans find it difficult to perceive things that are beyond the scale of our lives and the scale that we exist in. You know, so ages, years, you know, probabilities, when the probability is massive because we can't imagine so many different durations. And once we go through that threshold, we are completely changed. And then we can use it to make more connections, to articulate more clearly, more accurately, and more sort of proficiently. And so I think if we as teachers change the narrative towards threshold concepts, then I think we allow ourselves the opportunity to address this group of very, very important concepts. And I have read criticisms of the idea of threshold concepts, but I think what I read went beyond the practicalities of the classroom. You know, it was a niche argument where they were talking about the foundations of the theory itself. You know, I'm basing my stuff on Meyer and Land in their 2003 paper and sort of the stuff that came from that. But I think in terms of in the classroom, if we look at this set and we look at the features of a threshold concept, then we can make decisions on what to do next based on those.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge amount of sense, to, for want of a better phrase, to conceptualize it in that way. I think the other thing to note about these threshold concepts is that they're perhaps tricky for children to learn for slightly different practical reasons as well. I think the place value is quite a difficult thing to exemplify and to represent, despite the excellent use that teachers often make of base 10 equipment or number tracks or whatever it might be, and even things like number squares, in order to show different aspects of what we mean by base 10. So that's kind of quite conceptually complex, and often perhaps one might argue doesn't get the time dedicated to it that is required. Whereas I think something like number bonds, depending on how you look at them, either they are problematic because there are so many of them to learn, and it takes, if you try and learn them all in one go, it's just not going to take, and it's something that takes persistence and a little and often approach across a very long period of time. Or I would suggest, and there are actually lots of little conceptual pieces that go into allowing children to develop automatic recall of number bonds. The things like talking about compensation. So looking at things like near doubles, looking at bridging through 10, looking at different ways of dividing up single digit numbers. There's all sorts of bits and pieces in there that then contribute to an understanding of number bonds. So yeah, there are a couple of reasons why that can be challenging. And it's ditto, similar with multiplication tables. There's just quite a lot of facts to grasp over a long period of time. And so it requires a little and often approach. And if you don't have that little and often approach, very hard to pick it up all in one go.
Yeah, I accept the idea that the threshold concepts in general are very, very complex. But I think it doesn't necessarily make a distinction. You know, if we think about what pupils will have naturally developed before they encounter number bonds, I think it can be equally complex an idea to consider how this composition sort of works, and the fact that this generalizes to many, many other situations. You know, so I wouldn't draw a distinction between the different parts just because they appear more straightforward to us. You know, I think if I'm thinking, you know, certainly at 4, 5 years old, we're expecting children to come into contact with ideas. If we think that they'd just at 3.5 on average developed an understanding of cardinality, you know, we mentioned that when we talked about the principles of counting at one point or another. What we're focused on in terms of struggling mathematicians, these things are complex anyway. These things change who you are as a mathematician anyway. If you don't have those pieces, imagine how difficult that job is now, you know, as a learner, to try and learn something that the average, if it exists, you know, air quotes, pupil will find difficult anyway. You know, I think it almost amplifies the point, you know, and that's not to be argumentative. That's just a sort of rounding off my thinking as we're speaking, you know, because I'm using this as CPD for me.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, as you said that, I started thinking about the idea that actually what might seem a bit more complex to us as teachers isn't necessarily what is complex for the student. I mean, as soon as you started talking, I thought about, oh yeah, what about, I mean, arguably the most complex bit of understanding that any children have to deal with when it comes to mathematics is the grasping of what a number is. What does 4 mean? I mean, because that is a philosophically complex thing to actually answer, and we have to then hopefully approach it through multiple examples. And yet, as a teacher, it could be quite easy to fall into the trap, as I arguably did a moment ago, of just thinking, well, I don't have too many problems getting children to work with this thing, and thus it isn't actually as conceptually deep as something else.
Yeah, strong arguments there from both of you. Just while you were having that lovely back and forth, I just kind of got my brain thinking as well. It's just a few other things that from my own practice that from taking for granted maybe held some children back, perhaps not to the extent perhaps of not knowing number bonds, not knowing times tables, but certainly having a true understanding of equality and the equal sign is something that I've always spent a good lesson or two really exploring in depth as to what those 2 lines that we put in one box actually mean, and how you can manipulate that sign to, you know, do some weird and wonderful things that, you know, totally seems to just, it's just that change in mindset from of the children of, oh, this sign just means I put an answer next to it, versus right, I am balancing something here. What is on the right matches what's on the left. So that gives you that freedom to play around with mathematics a lot more. Again, probably not as won't hold children back as much as not knowing those number bonds, but it's just one of those small little wins that I've found that have really kind of helps children kind of make some sort of conceptual leap in that mathematical understanding. And it tends to be those children who do kind of struggle a little bit with maths, where they have that mindset of, oh, this symbol just means that I put what I think the answer is there. And the other thing that I just thought about was just general mathematical vocabulary. I don't want to generalize here, but certainly from my experience, those children who we're putting in this category as struggling mathematicians also tend to be struggling readers, or their vocabulary isn't as developed as perhaps other children are. And so really spending some time to focus on mathematical vocabulary, so they can do, as I think you alluded to it, Kieran, so they can explain in detail what these threshold concepts are, or where they are in their personal grappling with this idea. If they don't have the vocabulary to actually explain any of that, it just makes our job at diagnosing where they're going wrong that much harder. So being very explicit in making sure that children know the vocabulary, but also teachers making sure that the vocabulary that they use when teaching these concepts is really important. I know for the first kind of 3 or 4 years of my teaching, I used the word number and digit, interchangeably. Oh yeah, go and put this number in the place value chart. So they put 36 just all in the ones. And I'd be like, well, no, but really when you think about it, they put the number in the place value chart. What they did was correct. Whereas if I, really thought about my practice more deeply at the time, right, I want you to put the digit 3 in its correct place value, that again just makes that learning easier for those children as well.
This often comes down to the examples that we use, as well as the vocabulary, which is an important point that you made. It comes down to the examples that we use. If children only see 2, 3 digits, whatever it might be, plus, minus symbols on the left-hand side of the equation, and then equals, and then here it comes, then show an answer here as such, then that's the view of equality they're going to come away with. That's their understanding of the equal sign. It really comes down to making sure that they see a variety of answers. I had a conversation actually the other day with my partner, who I've said 100 times, secondary maths teacher, very fortunate to be able to talk mathematics with her. We were talking about how rarely, if ever, teachers talk about what is actually going on in an equation, or what it means to put, for want of a better phrase, the correct answer. How often in your career have you talked to children about the fact that, oh, well, what we're usually looking for is the simplest version of an answer? So for example, or simplest version of one side of an equation. Shouldn't use the word answer there. The simplest version of one side of an equation. What I mean by that is, let's say there was an exam paper, let's say year 6 SATs, and a question said 70 times 50 equals. If a child then wrote 700 times 5 in the answer box, they wouldn't be wrong, but they would not get the answer. And yet, how rarely have we talked to children about the idea that, yes, well, while this symbol represents equality, what we are usually looking for, if in doubt, a convention, what we are looking for, if in doubt, is the simplified version, or the most simple way of representing whatever it is that balances this equation. How rarely do we actually talk about that? I know I haven't across my career, and yet it's something that we just leave implicit when it comes to mathematics, when it comes to dealing with equality.
You're going to love Andrew Jeffrey's episode, because he has a superb anecdote about equations and about the reasoning that's happening, and how we only see the tip of the iceberg. So I won't put any spoilers, because it's about 3 weeks out, but yeah, it really complements that well. So I'm going to see if I can chop them up and put those points together. I've been really heartened to see the conversation nationally move towards curriculum prioritization. In particular, the work the NCTM have done, we're doing prior to the pandemic, where they were saying, here are the things in the national curriculum that are really important. These are the things you need to prioritize, because it's no secret that I think most of us think that there is too much in the national curriculum, Certainly our secondary colleagues think that there are things that they'd rather we didn't teach at all. I know we've discussed this in the past. And by moving to a model whereby they've mapped out, or they will soon have mapped out, what's most important in terms of what our pupils leave primary school knowing and understanding, I think helps a lot in terms of the time we can dedicate to our struggling mathematicians, because if we have a focus on here are the things that are most important, the things that unlock mathematics, the whole way through life, do these really well, then I think we're off to a better start than if we're not thinking with that mindset.
It's worth, I think, being quite precise about what competence means in these areas, because it's one thing to think, oh, well, children have grasped their number bonds when they can answer 7 + 5 in some form. It's another thing to quite precisely say, well, I want them to be able to answer 7 + 5 without having to explicitly count on. I want them to be able to answer it either using some kind of quick calculation strategy, or ideally moving into automatic recall. It's important, I think, to have an idea in your head as a teacher of what you mean by this is a gap and this is an area where they need to improve, and where you want them to get to, rather than just an idea of, oh, okay, this is a gap and I just want them to get a bit better at it. Having a real kind of idea of what competence, or dare I say, reaching a point where you're, really confident with a particular thing, what that looks like when you've got there.
So I think that leads on quite nicely to the sort of the second half of the chat. When might interventions be necessary, and how might they be employed?
In terms of, I think, when, obviously you're going to have, I'll answer this in two parts. Obviously you will have those children who do need it. I think the proactive leaders will look at how you can support those, but also think about, well, what has gone wrong within the mathematics curriculum in my school that has resulted in children actually needing this remediation in the first place. So I think it's a good way to think about it in your kind of like your cure and your prevention strategies that you might then go and put in place. So I think when we want to put cure strategies in place, I think certainly making sure that you're using high quality diagnostic questions is really important, because that just really focuses the attention on what it is that those students don't know about that particular mathematical idea, which means that then you can really target that short amount of time that you probably have with those children to make sure you are filling a gap. I wouldn't be using summative assessments like a SAT paper, for example, if I was trying to assess where a child I think needed some extra support in, because assessment theory and all of that, it tells us best not to use summative assessments necessarily for formative purposes. So definitely making sure that you have those high quality diagnostic questions, making sure that ideally the most qualified person available is available to actually do those interventions. Certainly through my time in the classroom, I've not been the one to deliver those, and it's kind of something that I've kind of really reflect on and really kind of make sure I think about how best to make that time that means that I can be the one who does those interventions. Certainly thinking about those models and manipulatives that you are going to use, finding the time to do it is always a struggle. I know a few schools try to do some sort of same day pickup to kind of prevent those that are struggling to fall further behind. And I know obviously we want to ensure that children do get a broad, balanced curriculum. However, some realism needs to come into it. What would you rather children not know, leave miss maybe 20 minutes of a history lesson, or actually leave primary school being mathematical? And it's an ethical question, which it's not particularly not a nice one to choose, but I think when you weigh it up and think of it like that, I think the answer is quite clear. And I also think, and I'm looking forward to hearing how schools get on with this. Certainly, Complete Maths and LaSalle seems to have done an excellent job with Tutor. For those of you that don't know, it's an online platform, very affordable, of online tuition, which can diagnose children where they're at in their mathematical journey and offer videos, offer questions to actually have a look at how well children are learning that mathematical journey. And you can set those prerequisites for an objective that you might be teaching. So if you're going to be doing rounding to the nearest 1,000 or 10,000, you want to make sure that those kids can actually round to the nearest 10 and the nearest 100. You can give them that to do, and then that will, the week before, or perhaps there's a bit of a pre-assessment, perhaps at the beginning of the week, or during an assembly time, and that will just allow you to then really focus and make sure, right, I know for them to access this next part of their learning journey that they're doing with me, I need to make sure they have ABC. Here's something that I'm going to ensure will tell me whether they have ABC before I try to teach the next part of the sequence.
I would say that the way that interventions are distributed across a week needs to quite carefully match the thing that you're looking to support children with. So, for example, if you were looking at supporting children with fluency of multiplication tables and related facts, it would make sense to do a little and often, 5 or 10 minutes a day, however it might fit into your timetable. Whereas if children had particular issues with place value, you might decide that you're better off with 30 minutes once or twice a week. The way that like I say, that you need to match what it is you're trying to teach to the distribution of time. I would also add that from my experience, if a teaching assistant is going to run your intervention, making sure that you frequently communicate what it is you're seeking to achieve, making sure that it's working properly. This is not to say that teaching assistants won't themselves kind of come to you and approach you and say, oh, I think this is working, or I think this needs to change. But it can be quite a difficult, having been a teaching assistant, it can be quite a difficult power dynamic to go to a teacher and say, I don't think this bit is working with these children, with this child here, and this is why. I mean, plenty of experienced teaching assistants will have that confidence to go and do that. But sometimes I think it makes sense for teachers to be a bit more maybe assertive and proactive in making sure that these things are working the way you want them to. I would say really under discussed part of interventions as well is exemplified by some of the pupil progress meetings I've been in over the years, where I've sat down, we've been at a table, and I've heard a teacher say that a particular student struggling with mathematics and they want to put a number bonds intervention in place. And I think, oh yeah, brilliant. That makes loads of sense. And then over time, through working with that teacher and working with that class, you find out that actually there's a big chunk of the class who are also struggling with number bonds to some extent, perhaps not to the same extent, but they are struggling with it to the same extent. And yet you've got this small group out of the room working on number bonds, maybe, during a history or an RE or a lesson or an assembly. A key point here is that it only really needs to be an intervention if it's something that the rest of your class do not need to work on. Because if the whole class needs to work on it, it isn't an intervention. It is something you have to try and bring into your practice. I know that sounds like a obvious and mundane thing to say, but the amount of times I've seen interventions where I've thought, actually, no, the whole class needs this. Why is the whole class not doing this for 5 minutes a day? So that's, I think, something to bear in mind. One last thing just to mention, I know this is going to sound very odd, but when I was a teaching assistant, I ran quite a few interventions where the teacher was almost apologetic to say, oh, well, I know this is going to seem a bit repetitive and boring at first, but honestly, stick with it. I promise that. And particularly with mathematics, what I found was that children were not bothered by the things that teachers thought were going to be boring and repetitive. Children loved repeating things and seeing their competence grow over a longer period of time. So don't worry perhaps about things looking boring and repetitive to you. again, from being on both sides of the situation, but from being a teaching assistant running interventions and a teacher running interventions, I think sometimes that there's nothing wrong with a little bit of repetition, or in fact, it's something absolutely essential about repetition. And don't worry about aspects of that you might think are tedious.
Yeah, adult projection is real. There are times I have to ask myself, is it me who's really annoyed here, or are they having an off day? And 9 times out of 10, it's me, because I haven't got to sleep the night before enough. I think I'm 100% on board with what you guys are saying. Whenever I saw and thought about the question when, I immediately thought of at the very start. The first thing came to mind was Bernie Westcott shared this, so I'll need to go back and find out exactly what the stat was. But it was something like kids come in at times to nursery or reception classes with an 18-month, there's an 18-month gap in existence. And then by the end of reception, that can be as much as 36 months. And then obviously, as we know, by the time they get to year 7, that gap can be close to 7 years, or in secondary school, it can be close to 7 years. And I think as a school, and thinking structurally and systematically, intervening in the early years, and I don't mean formal intervention in early years, I mean the way we've described it, as we've described it in past episodes where we looked at early number. Intervening in year 1, perhaps year 2, year 3, and then year 4. And if you do that successfully, 5 and 6 are a piece of cake. They're a blast, because you get to do the fun, well, in my opinion, the most fun primary school maths. And there's no stress about the fact that all these pieces from really important year groups, whenever I ask people, what's the most important year group? Gareth Metcalf talks about transition year groups, talking about year 3, year 1. Everybody always goes to year 1. Intervene early, and you will make life in school so much easier. So that's the first thing that came to my mind. Neil, you're talking about tutor. Whenever LaSalle got in touch with me about tutor, I was on board the very second. When they told us about their plans and about how they wanted to make it available to every child, regardless of their economic status, I couldn't have been more on board. And then as I saw, colleagues' lessons and the project progress, I thought this is something I would like to utilize, and certainly we've got to the point where, as our confidence in teaching mathematics and our capacity to teach mathematics has improved over the lifetime of the project that we've got going on at the minute, pupils have fewer and fewer gaps as they get up to school. And so we're going to try and utilize tutor with those pupils who we feel struggle, need intervention, and need intervention of a very, very high quality, so that all pupils are on this journey and they are enjoying that journey because it's not a struggle anymore. And it guarantees you that standard of instruction. And before we sort of committed to it, I said, if this does all the things that I hope it does, then it could potentially be really, really powerful. And I said to you guys, I really hope it does X, Y, and Z. And then I went to the webinar and it said, it has retrieval built in, it has those diagnostic questions, it has the ability to identify what a pupil needs and build on those prerequisites, all the things you want from a really high quality intervention. And I'm not being paid to say this. I am just sort of planting my flag. And I hope in a year's time, I will be able to say, this has had a marvelous impact on those pupils who, for one reason or another, were unable to engage with education during the sort of the peak of the pandemic. So I think it's well worth looking at if you are a school with pupils who did not engage, or with pupils who appear to have significant gaps as a result of the partial closures that we've sort of been through the last 2 academic years. But I think if we think about how might they be employed, it very much builds on what we said and what Tutor has built into it. We are thinking about what are the prerequisites, how can we model this in an expert fashion, and then over time, like you say, Chris, have they actually learned this? Has learning taken place? And so that in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, this is something they can utilize in the classroom.
And while we're on the subject of effectively companies that are doing things that we admire, I think it would be, remiss of me not to mention Numbots, Times Table Rockstars, because you won't find teachers in primary schools where it's been deployed and been deployed well, that haven't seen it had a positive impact on number bonds, multiplication tables. So certainly something to consider. I'm going to sound like a salesman here, but it really is dirt cheap compared to a lot of stuff that schools do. So yeah, consider that. I mean, and it's something, again, that can be run in a quite a simple fashion. It's something that can fit in with the idea of a little and often intervention that can have an impact in these areas. It's something that can be, the systems that are built into it work in a similar way to what you're describing with tutor. I think obviously on a much narrower aspect of mathematics, but still have this idea of retrieval, a cumulative sense of development built into them. So yeah, consider those.
I think when you consider the potential of tutor, and like you, Kieran, full disclosure, I did do a bit of work with them, but not been paid to actually say, anything that I have said. So should it work as it's intended to? I think when you think about what I said earlier about there being kind of like two strands, this cure and prevention, when you think about prevention side of it, I think if you almost have like a holy trinity there of things that are going to at a reasonable cost to schools that could actually mean that you don't end up having these large numbers of students with all of these gaps if you've been giving them that time for Numbots, Timetable Rockstars, and tutor there just at the point where it's actually needed. I think could be quite a powerful combination for schools.
I find that there's a definite correlation between those people who engage with Times Tables Rockstars and are confident mathematicians. I couldn't say in an academic paper, hand on heart, that it's not partly because those kids naturally work harder in general. But I can definitely say that if you're not working hard on Rockstars, your chances of success in primary school mathematics are greatly reduced. So I think that's worth thinking about. We've been using it since 2017, I think. So quite a big sample, and over the years this pattern has borne out. Those pupils who fly in sort of year 5 and 6 are those kids who put the legwork in with practicing their times tables. I suppose it makes sense, doesn't it? To what extent does dealing with confidence issues come into it, and how does support for struggling mathematicians change as children move through primary school?
I think those two things, it's sensible to put those two things together, because the big difference between working with struggling mathematicians in, say, year 5, 6 and working with struggling mathematicians, say, in Key Stage 1 is the way in which their self-esteem has become wrapped up with the struggles that they have in mathematics. I think from working with children further down the school, you can almost go into intervention work with a blank slate. You can just go in and say, okay, we're going to try this, we're going to do this, let's do this, and it'll be lovely. The further up the school you move, in my experience, the more that you have to unpick issues relating to confidence. In fact, I'd argue that almost like the first thing you have to do is you need to separate that link between their struggles with mathematics and their self-esteem. And what I mean by that is you have to almost entirely avoid praising children for getting things right, because you will, in a lot of cases, because you will amplify their sense of a lack of self-worth or self-regard when they then get things wrong. You almost have to be kind of completely neutral about the whole thing, at least for a while. You have to separate that link between, how they feel about themselves when they're doing mathematics and whether or not they're getting things right and wrong. One of the ways to do that is to almost play that system a little bit, is to give them the opportunity to get lots of things correct for a while, which might sound counterintuitive, because you're thinking, well, if they're getting lots of stuff right, you're probably not teaching them something brand new. And to an extent, there is a sense of trust to be developed there by giving them lots of things to do where they can show their competence. But a big part of that is to get them getting lots of things correct, and don't make it the biggest thing in the world. Don't say how wonderful they're doing or how brilliant it is that they're getting things right, because you're just setting yourself up for problems when you work on the stuff with which they struggle. You have to separate that link between confidence and their how they feel about themselves and how good they are at a certain aspect of mathematics, particularly, as I say, as you move further up the school.
You pretty much told my answer verbatim. I literally just wrote, the older they are, the issue of confidence is going to be massive, because they've potentially gone through the whole mathematical career, not getting that dopamine hit that you get when you solve a problem, when you do get something right, and all they've got is that frustration. So I literally said, when planning those initial mathematical interventions, plan for initial success within those interventions, so they are starting to feel, oh yeah, this is something that I can do. But and then, as you say, you make a great point there, don't then overpraise an 11-year-old because they can play a quick game with dice, right, and add up the numbers quicker than you can, because you talk about, I know McCourt talks a lot about trust, and how that trust is a massive part of the whole learning process. And effectively you're just delaying, or at worst denying that trust from actually taking part. And say it's a total different ball game in the lower down the schools they are, because you can take them, say we're going to go play a game, 10-15 minutes, and they're fine, they're happy as Larry, or they tend to be anyway. They probably haven't quite developed that self-awareness yet that maths is something that they can't, or they feel that they can't do.
I think you're both spot on. I think the advantage we have as primary teachers is that it's not too late to break down that sense of self and rebuild it in a way that is more conducive to success and to confidence and to a self-image that is a positive one in terms of mathematics. I think if I think back to who I was when I was 16, and this is totally anecdotal, a lot of that person still exists, and a lot of those neuroses still exist. I reckon someone teaching a pupil who is struggling at GCSE will have a much more difficult job of rebuilding that person up as a confident, proficient mathematician. I think if we think about the journey that our kids go through in history or geography, and their understanding of who they are and their place in the world is only really being shaped in the 7 years that we have them. I genuinely think it is early enough, even if a kid is in year 6, to strip down all the stuff that is holding them back in terms of becoming confident mathematicians and building them up. And I think it goes back to our feedback session that we had, the feedback episode. When you're in a session with a pupil who has historically struggled, it's about saying, look, you've done that correctly. You have understood this. Look at what you can do when you work hard. And piece by piece, they start to think, well, hold on a second, I'm doing this right. Not going, like, I absolutely agree with you, not going over the top and saying, oh, that's wonderful, this is fantastic. But it's a matter of fact. You've done this. What else can you do? And then they start to see themselves, I think, in that light. And I've seen children transform over a number of months. And I can only imagine what you've seen, Chris, working with pupils in a really intense situation over a number of years, because it must have been marvelous to see the end when you had built up this child who thought, yeah, I can do this, I'm ready for secondary. And equally, I'm thinking about how hard Sylvia's job must be, because I think the closer you get to 16, the closer you get to a fully formed ego. I'm not a psychologist. This is just me thinking about my experience of the world and how I interpret me and how I interpret my experience and the children I've seen. But I think, yeah, she must work tremendously hard for similar success that we experience in primary. And so I think we are at an advantage if people take the approach you guys have outlined. I'm 100% with you on that.
Well, what's interesting about the differences between primary and secondary is that you get teaching assistants that go from classroom to classroom to classroom, and we'll often see, for that reason, lots of different teachers. And one of the comments that Sylvia gets about her year 7 and year 8 classes, where she's at this stage of her career has had the confidence and the courage to go right back to the beginning of mathematics where required. One of the comments she gets from teaching assistants is, I don't get it. This is a bottom set, and yet they're doing mathematics. They're actually doing mathematics. And that's, in some ways, that's how low the bar is, because you'll go to set 7 or set 8 in year 7 or year 8 and year 9, and they are so switched off that it's just a battle, effectively. It's a battle to keep them in the room. It's just a case of, can I get through the lesson under certain circumstances? So I think you're dead right. I think the older children get, the harder it is to unpick these issues. I almost don't want to say it, but I'm going to. The thing that popped into my head was, there's a line in The Wire where I think it's Carver, who's growing into a really decent policeman, doesn't lock up these kids for a minor thing. And someone says, why not? And he says, well, until the handcuffs fit, there's talking to be done. And there's almost an extent to which this is the case. It's like, well, they're still young enough. They can be turned around. They can still develop a positive relationship with mathematics. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily that a child who is 15 and a half, who has not had that kind of education, or not had the kind of support that will allow them to do what you want them to do with mathematics, that is an age at which you can still turn things around. If there are teachers out there that can do that, wonderful, they are magicians. But it is certainly the case that there's still hope for children who are struggling with mathematics, even deep into secondary school. I think the key thing is, as I say, being willing to go down to the level of mathematics where the children initially started to struggle. And often that will be stuff, even in secondary school, that will be stuff that relates to content that is from year 2, content that is from year 1 or year 3. And schools are very rarely at secondary level given teachers are very rarely given that level of trust at a secondary level, unfortunately, from discussions I've had with secondary teachers anyway.
If you think about the parallels this has with reading, it's not my intention for us to take this podcast and make it the Thinking Deeply About Secondary Education podcast. But if you think about talking to colleagues about reading at secondary and being willing to go back to the phonetic level, and the impact that has on pupil progress in terms of decoding, fluency, and then success in other subjects, I think the conversation is very similar in terms of how we can help those children. Going right back to what Neil said, we need these children to be numerate and literate so that they can engage in society in a positive fashion. I think every child deserves that. And I think we need to make sure that we as teachers are doing what we can, and as schools doing what we can to make sure that by the time they leave with their qualifications, whatever they may be, they are equipped for the things that life will throw at them and able to flourish. And I think you don't do that if you're illiterate or if you're illiterate, so I think they're very important points.
Just thinking from personal experience and my own dad, who really struggled with literacy, it's just that much harder to do the things that you want to do, to contribute in the ways that you want to contribute, if you have struggles with literacy, struggles with numeracy. I mean, it's still utterly possible, but it's just how much more difficult it is for the individuals in place there. So I totally agree with you.
One thing that I've also found, just going back to this confidence issue, is the amount of difference, especially further up the school you get, is that if there is some way you can arrange for that intervention to happen in your room, so there isn't that almost parading of those children who are get up, get out, leave for 20, 25 minutes, whatever, and then almost kind of do that walk of shame coming back in halfway through a lesson. If you can somehow arrange for it to make sure that you can get those in your classroom, that also makes a massive difference to their confidence. With social creatures, And children, particularly upper key stage 2, year 5, year 6, they can read a room, I think, better than any adult can. So they know what to latch onto. They know that there is that social shame of, that physical movement of them having to leave the classroom to go and get some remedial help. So if you can be clever with your timetable, so certainly one of the first teachers that I kind of worked with in my NQT year, she took upon herself basically, and I've stolen the idea pretty much ever since, that those first 20 minutes after lunch, that's quote unquote intervention time. If you don't need it, you can find something to do independently, whether that's you just read silently by yourself, but those 20 minutes straight away after lunch, I am working with an already predetermined, with a group that you already know that needs an intervention, and you just use those 20 minutes for something short and sharp, so they're actually getting it there and then in that room. And although children are doing different things, it's still less of a social barrier than that physical having to move to another place to do that intervention.
Yeah, it comes down to trade-offs around arguably the most important thing that we develop in children in school, or one of the most important things, which is that sense of belonging. So what I mean by trade-offs in belonging are that if you might have to say, okay, we're going to do 20 minutes with this group of children, and they're not doing the same thing as the rest of their class, which might make them feel that, they don't, to an extent, that they don't belong in the same way, or it makes them feel somewhat divided. What you perhaps, the cost of that is hopefully more than offset by the sense of belonging that those children gain from the fact that when it's maths time for an hour every day, they are part of it and they feel like they can flourish along with the rest of their class. So like you say there about keeping children ideally in the room where they usually are taught in order to have these interventions, minimizing the costs in terms of belonging and then maximizing the benefits in terms of belonging. I think actually there's a whole episode on the importance of belonging to children. The amount of times that I've seen children being reprimanded in a way that makes me think, no, you're unnecessarily cutting into this idea of belonging. When a teacher says, oh, no one else in the class does this, it's just you. There's another way to word that. There's another way to word that says you are part of our class and as an important part of our class as anyone, and thus, rather than why are you different? Why aren't you part of our group? Like I say, I think there's a whole episode on belonging. I think it's a hugely under-discussed aspect of teaching generally. It's probably talked about a bit in primary education, but I think it could be something that's talked about more. Very briefly, if I may, just thinking about the idea of confidence a bit further. I don't think that there's any harm in calculated dishonesty with children in certain moments. And what I mean by that is I have lost count of the number of times in year 5 or 6 where a group of children have come across something that's particularly challenging and you can see they're wobbling a little bit, and just being able to say, oh yeah, when I was in year 5, this caught me off guard a bit as well. It took me a bit longer, but it became really useful to me. So let's keep going with it. But even if that isn't necessarily the case, I think sometimes just putting you in their shoes and letting them see that it's perfectly normal to struggle in that way is something that I think is okay.
I think you're absolutely right, Chris. We're definitely going to come back to some of the themes here in more depth in later episodes. But all that's left to say is thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Christopher.
Always a pleasure.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.